Hello and welcome back to another episode of Charge. With me today in the studio I have Sheila Jambekar from Twilio and Maria Christina from Develop.
Hey.
Hello.
Today our topic is GDPR, a subject on which Sheila is an expert. And so let's jump in with a quick introduction from you, Sheila, a bit more about what Twilio does and what your role is at Twilio.
Sure. So Twilio is a cloud communications platform. What that means is that we give software developers, the power to incorporate communications into their software programs. So we're one of those companies that's sort of behind the scenes. Many people have probably actually used our services without really realizing it. For example, John Lewis uses Twilio's platform, Airbnb, TransferWise. We have over 1.6 million developers globally. So huge market, and everybody needs to communicate. So lots of different companies have figured out how to use Twilio's products. So in terms of what I do there, I'm in the legal team. I'm the Associate General Counsel. My primary role is to head up our privacy program at Twilio. We process a lot of communications. That's a lot of personal data. So it's important that we take data protection seriously.
Great. And so today we're here to talk about GDPR, which, as many of you know, is a very hot topic right now with the deadline fast looming. So what does GDPR stand for?
GDPR, for the uninitiated, stands for General Data Protection Regulation. So general in the sense that it applies across industries and probably business units within any given company. It's not just a technology law, it's not just a communications law, it's not just an HR, human resources law, it is all of those things. And data protection is a reference to what in the US we would call privacy law. It is a law about the protection of personal data and ensuring that organizations that process personal data do so responsibly. It's a regulation, meaning that it applies directly at the EU level across member states. So member states do not have to then enact their own local laws or member state level laws to implement the regulation. It's applying directly.
How is it changing data protection laws as they stand in the EU and in the UK?
Well, I mean, I could get into the nitty-gritty details, but I won't go that deep. At the very highest level, the principles of data protection are largely the same from the directive, which was before the GDPR and into GDPR. That said, there are some really important differences, which is part of the reason why it's getting a lot of attention. The first one is that the fines are a lot bigger. The fines under GDPR can go up to 20 million euro or 4% of global revenue. So that is nothing to sneeze at. So companies before who might have thought, we'll just hope we don't get caught, and if we do, we'll pay a small fine. You can't really treat it that way anymore. That's just too big. The other thing that's different is that it applies regardless of whether you have actual facilities in the EU. So it's going to apply to companies that process personal data in the EU, but also to companies and organizations that are outside the EU that nonetheless process personal data of EU residents. So that's why it's getting a lot of attention globally, because GDPR recognizes that in today's day and age, with cloud companies very much like Twilio, you can tap into the EU market, you can sell your services into the EU market, or collect information from EU residents without actually having to set foot in the EU.
In fact, I think you've mentioned that it's setting the golden standard now for data protection, GDPR, and that Twilio as a company is going to apply it across the board. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. So we're looking at GDPR as an opportunity really to up-level our data protection worldwide. We could have taken the approach, which is completely legally valid, to say, well, let's find where the EU personal data is on Twilio's systems and which customers this impacts, and then we will make sure that we are complying as to those specific workflows. But we decided, even if it's not legally mandated, all of our customers want us to be good data stewards. They want us to be good stewards of their data and handle it appropriately. Why not just give everybody a GDPR level of data protection? Let's do that. And I think it's the right thing to do as well.
Yeah, so there's value in it as a trust and branding exercise.
Absolutely. I mean, I happen to be also a privacy advocate at heart. So there's a personal aspect of this, which I think it's the right thing to do. But from a business point of view, yes, there is a branding aspect. We are a cloud company and we are built on trust. If you don't trust us, you don't use us. And so this is a way for us to demonstrate that we are worthy of the trust that our customers put in us, that we are going to be thinking about data protection and taking it very seriously so that our customers know we're doing our best, we've got their back. The other aspect of it is just looking forward to the future. I don't see that we're going in the direction of less data protection worldwide. Everybody's moving in the direction of more data protection. Even the US is moving in the direction of more data protection. And so getting ahead and taking this seriously now with this opportunity with GDPR gives us sort of a leg up to get ahead on the next data protection framework that comes along and that our customers need us to comply with.
Do you find that your customers are also much more aware of this standard that companies need to uphold to gain their trust?
I think definitely from our perspective, we're a B2B company, right? So we serve enterprises. Yes, our customer base is primarily developers, but developers work for companies. So I think from that perspective, yes, we are seeing that companies are more aware of their obligations to protect personal data, and they are aware of their obligations to ensure their service providers are protecting personal data. Consumers just tend to be a little bit slower to kind of catch up with the concerns, but there of course are many consumers who are already concerned, so you might as well sort of address those concerns ahead of any sort of bad thing happening, which you hope will never happen, but preventing that from happening is the right thing, even if you don't have consumers who are explicitly clamoring for that at the moment. You know that it's going to pay dividends in the end.
And the consumer or the individual is absolutely the focus of GDPR, as it hands them, I think, 6 rights. I wonder if you could take us through this.
So there's about 6 data subject rights that are identified within GDPR. I'll try to remember to flag the ones that are somewhat new. One of them is the right to be forgotten. This is RTBF for us cool kids. What that means is it's the right for a data subject to ask a company to delete their data, to delete the personal data that they have about them. The other one is right to access. So I have a right to know what a company is processing about me. What is the data that they have about me? Another one of them is the right to rectification, basically the right to fix the data. If I find out that the data that company has about me is inaccurate or incomplete, I have a right to say, hey, please fix it, and this is what I'd like you to do to fix it. The right of portability is the right to take your personal data from one provider to another. That's an interesting one. There's a lot of commentary around what that's really trying to drive at, and that if it really even belongs as a privacy law. But it does certainly put the individual in the driver's seat. I can take my data from one provider and bring it over to another. I don't get locked in. The idea is that you don't get locked into a particular provider as easily. Another one is the right to restrict, to request that your data be restricted in its use. So a really common example of this, which we probably all use all the time, is let's say that you have an account with a particular company. You say, well, you're allowed to email me and use my email address in order to let me know about important account-related issues, like your account's been hacked or we've changed the terms of service, but you are not allowed to use my email address to market to me. So I'm setting a restriction on what you're allowed to use my personal data for. Then the last one is I have a right to register an objection to how someone is using my personal data and say, I don't want you to use my email address at all for marketing or for any other purpose. I don't like that you're going to do it. That's what your plans are. So all of these data subject rights are not 100% absolute. I mean, I think for a lot of businesses, those would look and sound very scary because you think, oh my gosh, if the customer deletes their personal data or insists that they get to delete their personal data, I can't even bill them or operate my business or pay my taxes because I need that information as part of my revenue accounting. All of these rights have sort of a nuance to them in that if you have a more legitimate reason why you cannot allow a data subject to fulfill those rights, then you can certainly refuse to facilitate their exercise of it. However, the important thing is that the default is that they should have them. So it's going to be on the organization who is saying, no, I'm not going to let you facilitate those rights, to be able to explain and prove that they were in the right in doing so. It's not going to be on the data subject to have to explain why they should be allowed to have their data deleted. It's on the company to explain why they can't delete the individual's data.
So in terms of attitude, what those rights are really doing is clarifying that data is the property of the individual about whom it concerns, and that businesses are custodians of that data for a while?
Yeah, I would say that's probably a good way of putting it. I like to say it's sort of putting the individual in the driver's seat. I have a right to sort of determine how my personal data is used. Property is one way of describing it, driver's seat, but the idea is the same, right? It's that I can control how my personal data is used. And there of course has to be sort of a reasonable balance.
Yes.
Businesses need to operate. Consumers want services, and we can't shut down commerce. It's not good for anybody, business or for the consumers, if we don't allow for any processing of personal data. But the idea is that as an individual, I should be able to control it. I'm in charge. And obviously within reason. So if I knowingly give my personal data over to a business in order to provide a service, then of course I should expect that they're going to use it to provide that service, and that there may be some needs like legal purposes or for tax or accounting why they may still have to hold on to some of my personal data. That's sort of understood and should be understood by most individuals, that if I give my credit card to a business in order to pay for something, they're going to need to do things with that credit card. I can't say, oh, and I'd like you to delete that right away before you've had a chance to charge it. Of course, you have to allow businesses to carry out what they're doing. But it ultimately is, the idea is to put that individual in the driver's seat, to allow the individual to sort of decide how they are presented to the world and how they are presented to organizations.
Yeah, it's really empowering for the consumer. They feel like they're not going to be taken advantage of.
That's the idea. That's the hope. That's the idea. I mean, there is also a right of transparency, which is sort of embedded in that, which is this idea that you have to be transparent about how data is going to be processed. So as an organization that's processing personal data, the individual has a right to know what you're going to do with it. That's, of course, the very first step in being empowered, right? And being able to be in the driver's seat. I can't drive blind, so I need someone to tell me, well, what is it that I'm agreeing to do when I sign up for your service?
That's actually a really interesting point, because how would you reckon the really large data processing companies like Facebook or Amazon, how do you reckon they're going to deal with that kind of transparency?
I don't work for Facebook or Amazon, so I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what they're thinking. I think you're going to see a lot of what you already see, but maybe just a little bit more easier to read kinds of privacy policies. I think what you're going to see is that big companies will continue to have your standard privacy notice that's on your website, but then they'll probably start doing more just-in-time kind of notices, meaning like at the point of collection, we're collecting your email address so we can do this, this, and this with it, so that the consumer sees immediately. Because I think we all know that ultimately consumers are not going to typically read really lengthy privacy notices. Nonetheless, those privacy notices are necessary to really kind of lay out for those who are interested in having the more detail. So I don't see those going away. And, frankly, as a person who has to sort of do both of those things, it's a very tricky thing to try to explain everything you're doing and yet not inundate. So that's where I think we'll see smaller privacy notices along the way for the very sensitive types of data or potentially unexpected reasons for collection. And then you're also going to see that stuff in those longer privacy notices. Whether greater transparency will mean that consumers take that opportunity to really think about how their data is being used, I think we could debate whether that's actually going to drive any new behavior or change things. But at least it could. At least the individual is given the opportunity to understand what's going on. I think we'll see also people will make mistakes, and then we will all learn from those mistakes.
Inevitably.
Inevitably, there always. I mean, I think there's a lot of us who are just hoping that we're not the first one to make the mistake, and that we can watch somebody else's mistake and learn from that. But I think that's why it's important to sort of make that good faith effort to try to do the right thing. no one's going to be perfect all the time, but you've got to try your best.
I mean, in terms of people making mistakes, some spokespeople from HSBC and John Lewis, your own friends, publicly complained that GDPR is, quote, woolly. Would you agree with that? I mean, it's about interpretation of it, right?
Yes, and so woolly, I'm like, okay, what does that mean in British speak? So I'm assuming you mean it's a little bit mushy or at times ambiguous.
It's confusing. I mean, we're having this debate now, and there are thousands of hours of people talking about this at events and podcasts and articles because it's confusing.
Yes. I mean, it's hard, I guess, to cut some slack to the drafters. It's hard to sort of cover every industry and every possible angle and write up a law that covers everyone. But yes, there's going to be a lot open to interpretation. Quite frankly, I think the reason why everybody is sort of up in arms about that lack of clarity is still because the fines are so big, right? So if we were looking at, it might be $1,000 fine, or if it was really clear that all the regulators were going to not start at 4% of global turnover, but maybe start with lower fines at first as people learn. I think we're all hoping that will happen, but they won't sort of come out of the gate with really massive fines for inadvertent errors or misinterpretations. But of course, they haven't come out and said, oh, well, we're not going to fine you at that level. That's what's of course causing a lot of angst, is because God forbid you make a misinterpretation, it's much more at risk than there used to be if you made a little misstep. Yes, I do think that there's still a lot that's going to be open to interpretation. The data protection regulators are offering some interpretive guidance, so it's a good idea to kind of keep an eye out for these Working Party 29 papers. But they have a lot of work to do as well, and they can't possibly get to everything that they would probably hope to get to in terms of interpreting GDPR and providing clarity in time for the May 25th, 2018 deadline. I think there's also going to be things where they may not even realize it's unclear until after someone makes a misstep. So I think the important thing is we have to sort of hope that the regulators are thinking about this from they have limited resources, and so we need to go after the really bad ones first, and we will use these first few months, years maybe even, to help companies understand how they are going to be interpreting things, such that if there's a mistake, they won't go straight for the jugular at 20 million, but maybe they'll say, well, here's a little slap on the wrist, and do better next time, and we will all learn from that. But the important thing, I think, is that you need to make a good faith interpretation. What concerns me is that, particularly for tech-heavy companies with lots of software developers are brilliant at finding really clever ways to get around problems. And that's not a bad thing, because in the world of software, you often have a tricky problem and you have to figure out a way to get around whatever that tricky problem is. The problem is that doesn't translate well when it comes to implementing the law. Because the law, of course, there's technical compliance with the letter of the law, but there's also a spirit of the law that is incredibly important as well. And I think particularly at this time where GDPR is still woolly, the spirit of the law is almost more important to try to solve for, because it may not be clear what the technical letter of the law is. So if you're thinking about, well, I don't know whether this says go left or go right, to think about, well, what is it that GDPR is trying to do? Sort of going back to what those principles are, going back to this idea of putting the individual in the driver's seat and thinking, okay, well, I could go left or right, but if I go right, that is in the spirit of the law. So the best solution is to go right.
Yeah, so in good faith interpretation rather than a strategic interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, yes, if you use strategic in this sort of sly way, yes. Yes, if it should rather...
The raised eyebrow.
Exactly, with that raised eyebrow that people aren't going to be able to see on the podcast. But yes, don't try to be too clever and cute. I don't think that the regulators are going to find it terribly cute that you came up with this really fascinating way to kind of thread the needle around the law. Again, if you're going for the spirit of the law, I think you're also, and again, this is just my opinion, and it's hopefully my hope as well, that I think the regulators will cut you more slack. If what you're doing is in the spirit of the law, and then they say, well, it doesn't technically comply with the letter of the law, I think they're more likely to give you maybe not a pass, but you might get that slap on the wrist instead of the fangs of a 20 million euro fine.
You mentioned the principles of GDPR. Could you talk us through those, and what's the idea behind them?
So the first principle is of lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So you need to have a lawful basis for processing personal data. For some, that is explicit affirmative consent from the individual. For others, there may be a legitimate business purpose, such as I need to be able to bill you, or I need to be able to pay my taxes or calculate my taxes. Or it could be I have a legal claim that relates to you, and therefore I need to hold on to this as evidence. There's also a fairness and transparency, and that kind of gets back to what I mentioned before, that you need to be clear about what it is that you're doing. You need to tell people, we're processing your personal data for these purposes, and this is what we're going to do with it. And you should do so in a way that is coherent. Make it so that people can understand it. And that's important to think about who your audience is as well. It's not so much an issue for Twilio, given where we fit into the space, but for any developer who is targeting younger people, particularly children. There's a whole host of issues if you're going to be working with children, but if you're targeting an audience that is going to be younger, perhaps less sophisticated, you've got to think about that when you're drafting up your explanation of what you're doing. How do you explain it to a 14-year-old if that's who you're targeting? Another principle is this principle of purpose limitation. It basically means you should have a purpose for why you're collecting personal data, and your processing should be driven by that purpose. It should be limited to that purpose. Data minimization means don't collect what you don't need. Accuracy is really focusing on this idea that personal data that is being used about a person should be complete and accurate. Now, that's going to seem really obvious to a lot of businesses, because how is it helpful or useful to them if they have inaccurate personal data about one of their customers? But this can also have a lot of impact on the individual as well. Just take the credit reporting space, for example. If the information about your credit is inaccurate, you might not get a loan. And that's a really big deal. You might not get that car loan, that home loan, that business loan that you really are looking forward to. Another important principle is this concept of storage limitation. It's kind of the other end of data minimization. Data minimization is don't collect what you don't need. Storage limitation is don't keep what you don't need. And I like to think of personal data, if it's not working for you, it's kind of working against you. You're not getting any value out of it, that it's just sitting on your systems causing risk if there was a hack or a breach of some sort. The next principle is of integrity and confidentiality. Basically, that's appropriate security. It's a risk-based analysis. Not all personal data is treated equal or seen as equal, but based on the level of risk associated with the personal data, you should have commensurate, appropriate security measures in place. And then the last one is a somewhat new one for EU data protection law, which is this concept of accountability. In other words, you need to be responsible for personal data and protecting personal data at an organization. It's not going to be the regulators kind of keeping an eye on you. You're expected to keep an eye on yourself, which means you really should have somebody at the company paying attention. It doesn't necessarily have to be the lawyer. That for bigger organizations, it probably will be. But obviously not every company can afford to have an in-house attorney or an in-house security team. But you should have somebody who is watching over these issues and paying attention to the data protection issues. For bigger companies, ones that process a lot of personal data, they may actually have to, under GDPR, hire a data protection officer or appoint a data protection officer. Another aspect of accountability is that it's not sufficient to simply do data protection right. You should be able to prove it. Imagine if you got audited. Like, what would you show an auditor that proves that you're doing data protection properly? That's where things like written policies, maybe they feel like, oh gosh, who wants to write it all down? But they can be worthwhile. One, they make sure that everybody is on the same page as to what the rules are within an organization. So having it written down can be a very good thing, but it's also a way of being able to demonstrate that you take it seriously. Another thing that's really important are things like data mapping, making sure you have good documentation about the flows of data through your systems, and employee training. You could have great written policies, but if you don't teach them to your employees, even well-intentioned employees could make a mistake that could cost you, millions.
So the accountability piece really seems to be at the heart of GDPR, this idea that companies are now being given the responsibility to protect data and to take care of it in a very regulated and good manner, really. So how did Twilio approach this problem? I know there's no playbook to how one should implement GDPR for one's company, but it's always good to hear an example and to hear how someone who is at the forefront sort of GDPR implementation, how they've thought about it and how they've seen the process evolve.
Yeah, so I think it's been a long process, and that's just sort of natural for a lot of larger companies. And we're not huge yet, but we're probably bigger than a lot of our customers are. So the first thing I think that's really important is making sure that you have your senior leadership on board. For something as holistic and broad-based as GDPR, it is likely to touch a lot of different teams within an organization. It's going to impact them. So having everybody at the tone at the top, well, it sounds cliche, it's actually incredibly important. I think perhaps more so for GDPR than anything else that I've had to deal with in my career, because of how it has those cross-functional interdependencies and factors to it. The scope and breadth of it is really large as well. So for a lot of companies, including Twilio, there are trade-offs. To do GDPR, there were things we can't do, but we understood the importance of getting it done, and so we had to make sure that our senior leaders understood what the trade-offs were going to be. So we spent a lot of time up front just scoping. It started out with back of the envelope, how many engineers do we think this is going to take? How many hours, how many weeks, what are the cross-team dependencies? And then we decided to take it an extra step of actually bringing in a third party. And the third party did a gap analysis for us that allowed us to hone in on the scope of the undertaking. And after that, we kind of had a core team that got together. We call it sort of our A team, our core team. These are the architects, myself. We have a program manager, our CISO, and a security architect, all working together to sort of figure out how are we going to take these sort of broad-based principles and operationalize them. How do we turn them into engineering projects? And so that was sort of our next step. And then we broke it down into projects, and then we started just tackling those projects. We're tackling those projects one at a time. We started with retention and deletion. The reasons for that were it's a really big project to tackle. There's a lot of cross-team dependencies that we knew we were going to have to kind of work through. There's also some hygiene that you get out of a retention and deletion program first, right? So in the process of trying to make sure that you are deleting data you don't need, only retaining it where you do, you might find out if we re-architected this, then we actually don't need to process personal data at all in this service. And then that service becomes out of scope. So that makes it easier for the downstream. And now we're just kind of marching through it. Another project that's really more on the legal side is making sure our vendor management is up to snuff. That's a really big one, making sure your service providers are also applying GDPR principles in processing personal data on your behalf. And that is part of the accountability. You are not just accountable for how you're processing personal data, you are accountable for how your service providers are processing personal data in your name.
So what would be, just to wrap things up, what would be the one piece of advice you'd want to give to anybody who's, thinking about GDPR, sort of about to set off on the journey that it is? Where should they start? What should they do? What sort of...
Oh gosh. Honestly, I think the one piece of advice is start now. If you're trying to build a house and you need to move in by May 25th, 2018, it's better to find out right now that it's going to take you 1 month, and then you can just wait till April to start, than to find out in April that it's going to take you 6 months. So no better time than the present to really make sure you understand what it's going to take to get there. Because again, the deadline's not moving, and so you want to make sure that you have given yourself enough time, because it's so broad-based. You just may run across things that you weren't expecting, and you don't want to find that out too late.
Yeah, Okay, well, that's the message that our readers should definitely take away, so I think that's time to end. Thank you so much for coming in.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
And good luck with the implementation.
And to all of your
Yes.
listeners as well.
I hope that the EU don't make an example of anyone that we know.
Yes, exactly. Fingers crossed it won't be any of us.
Okay, bye.
Bye.